I've always been fascinated by stories of parallel worlds, but I never thought I'd end up in one. The idea of stepping through some invisible veil and ending up in a world just like ours, but twisted, different enough to be unsettling, had always intrigued me. In my literature classes, I would talk about Borges and Kafka, about how fragile our perception of reality truly is. But those were just stories. And stories, after all, are supposed to stay on the page. Until they don't. It was a regular Tuesday. I was home, like any other day, in my small apartment in the center of the city. The place had a Gothic charm to it. Dark walls, wooden floors that creaked like they were whispering secrets under your feet, and tall windows that never seemed to let in enough light. The building had a heaviness to it, the kind that makes you feel like you're never quite alone. I'd lived there for years, and though I'd gotten used to the weight of the atmosphere, I couldn't shake the feeling that the walls held memories I didn't want to know. I taught literature to bored college students, so most of my days were spent surrounded by words and silence. It suited me. The old books, with their worn pages and forgotten worlds, were the closest thing I had to company. At night, though, the silence wasn't comforting. It was oppressive, settling over the apartment like a thick fog, stifling my thoughts. That was when I first started hearing the creaks, the ones I couldn't explain. It all changed when I found the mirror. I'd been wandering through an antiques fair on a Sunday afternoon, just browsing without intention, when I saw it. Hidden in the back of a stall, covered in dust and half forgotten, was an ornate mirror. It was beautiful in a haunting way. The frame was heavy, carved with intricate designs that looked like twisting vines and serpents, but what caught my eye was the glass. It was old, slightly fogged, like a window that had seen too many winters. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it, compelled to touch it. And so I bought it, brought it home, set it up in my bedroom. That's when the nightmares began. At first it was small things. I'd catch glimpses of shadows passing behind me in the reflection, just at the edge of my vision. When I'd turn around, nothing would be there. I convinced myself it was the lighting, or maybe the old mirror playing tricks on me. But then the figures started to take shape. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were outlines, faint but undeniable, of people who weren't supposed to be there. I wasn't the paranoid type, not really. But after the second week of this, I couldn't ignore it. One evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw it clearly for the first time. There was someone standing just behind me. A figure, tall and gaunt, with long, thin fingers stretched toward me. My heart froze in my chest. I turned, but the room was empty. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, those fingers reaching for me, as if trying to pull me into the mirror. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. Stress? Maybe. Teaching always wore me down by the end of the semester, and I wasn't sleeping well anyway. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. Something about the mirror felt wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. The next night, I woke up in a different place. I had been tossing and turning, the unsettling feeling growing stronger when I finally drifted off. When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in my bedroom. Or at least, not the one I knew. The air was thicker here, heavy with a metallic smell that coated my throat. My bed was the same, the room was the same, but something was horribly, undeniably different. The walls were cracked, black veins running through the plaster as though the building was rotting from the inside out. The windows were smeared with dirt, blocking out what little light there was. The furniture, once merely old, now looked decayed, as though it had been left to rot for years. I scrambled out of bed, my pulse hammering in my ears. Panic rose in my chest like bile. I ran to the door, but when I opened it, I found myself standing in the same room I had just left. I slammed the door shut and tried again. Same result. No matter how many times I turned the handle, I was trapped. Every door led back to the bedroom, and then I saw her. At first, I thought it was another reflection in the mirror. But as I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't just a reflection. There was a woman in the room with me. She was standing at the edge of the mirror, her face twisted in a silent scream, her eyes wide with terror. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her clothes were stained with blood. She looked exactly like me. The mirror was not just a reflection of the physical world. It was a gateway, a door to something far darker. I could feel it now, pulling me in every time I got close. The woman in the mirror, my mirror self, was one of many. I began to see more of them, different versions of me, their eyes hollow, their bodies distorted and deformed. They were trapped, lost in dimensions that were layered on top of each other, each more grotesque than the last. I realized then that this wasn't just a nightmare. This was a prison, a twisted version of reality, where time didn't work the way it should, and every choice I made led me deeper into the labyrinth. Days blurred together. Every time I tried to leave, I would end up back in the apartment, only it was never quite the same. Sometimes the walls were covered in black mold, oozing down like blood. Other times, the furniture was burned and twisted, as if it had been through a fire, and always I felt the presence of the other Charlottes, watching, waiting. The worst part was I knew they were me, versions of myself from other realities, other timelines. They had all tried to escape, and they had all failed. I could see it in their eyes, the despair, the madness. They were trapped, just like I was, and soon I would become one of them. It was in one of these twisted realities that I met her. The Charlotte who had started it all. She was older, her face lined with exhaustion and fear, her eyes sunken deep into her skull. She told me the truth I had been avoiding all along. I had made a pact with something, a dark entity that lived between the worlds. I had been curious, eager to explore other dimensions, to see what lay beyond the veil of reality. But I had lost control. Each time I jumped between worlds, I fractured my own existence, splitting myself into 1,000 versions, each one trapped in its own nightmare. The mirror was the key, but it had become a curse. There was no way out now. "You're just one of many," she whispered, her voice hollow, "and soon, you'll be lost too." I didn't want to believe her, but deep down, I knew she was right. Every time I touched the mirror, I felt myself slipping further away, my mind unraveling. The other Charlottes were already waiting for me, their hands reaching out, eager to pull me into their world. In the end, there was no escape. Every attempt to leave just led me back to the same place, the same nightmare. I became another version of myself, trapped in a dimension that wasn't quite real, but wasn't quite a dream either. The mirror still stands in my bedroom, but I no longer recognize the person staring back at me. She looks like me, but she's not. None of them are. We're all just fragments now, pieces of a broken puzzle that can never be put back together. I've stopped trying to escape. The cycle never ends, and each time a new version of me takes my place, the old one is erased. I can feel myself fading, my thoughts slipping away like sand through my fingers. In the end, I am nothing but a ghost, just another shadow in the mirror. The building where I work is a monstrosity of glass and steel that rises like a spear against the perpetually gray sky of our city. My name is Jonas, and I'm an engineer. I deal with numbers, equations, and logic every day. Or at least that's how I used to define my life before that fateful day. The monotony of my work was only interrupted by the occasional distorted reflection I saw in the mirrored windows. Sometimes, I swore I saw something moving in the shadows between the reflections, but I always dismissed it as my imagination. After all, engineers aren't supposed to get carried away by fantasies, right? That afternoon, the air felt heavier than usual. The silence in the corridors was almost palpable, as if the building itself was holding its breath, anticipating something. I should have noticed the signs, but my rational mind ignored them. When the clock struck 6 p.m., I grabbed my briefcase and headed to the elevator. The metallic sound of the doors opening echoed down the empty hallway, like a dark invitation. I stepped inside, pressed the button for the ground floor, and waited. That's when everything changed. The elevator began to move, but something was wrong. The sensation of movement felt different, as if we were descending through molasses. The lights flickered once, twice, before stabilizing in a sickly glow. A low hum filled the cabin, making my teeth vibrate. I tried to convince myself it was just a mechanical failure, but a voice deep in my mind screamed that this was something far, far worse. The numbers on the digital panel began to flash erratically. 12, 7, 23, -5. Wait, -5? Since when do we have negative floors? My heart raced, my breathing grew heavy. The air inside the cabin seemed to be thickening, as if reality itself was warping around me. Minutes passed, or was it hours? Time seemed to have lost all meaning in that confined space. When the doors finally opened, I was ready to bolt. But what I saw made me freeze in place. In front of me stretched a corridor that seemed straight out of a nightmare. The walls, once white and pristine, were now peeling and stained as if they had aged decades in a matter of minutes. The smell of mold and decay invaded my nostrils, making my stomach churn. I took a hesitant step out of the elevator, and the doors closed behind me with a dull thud. The silence that followed was deafening, as if it were sucking all the air out of my lungs. I began to walk, my footsteps echoing disturbingly. The corridor seemed to stretch on infinitely, curving slightly ahead, always preventing me from seeing what lay beyond the next turn. The shadows on the walls appeared to move out of the corners of my eyes, as if they were watching me, mocking my confusion. Suddenly, I saw another elevator door. I ran toward it, frantically pressing the call button. The doors opened, and I stepped inside, desperate to escape. But when the doors opened again, I was back in the same cursed corridor. That's when the reality of my situation began to sink in. I was trapped in a loop, a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. As I wandered through the endless corridors, I began to encounter other people, or at least what had once been people. The first one I saw was a woman, her face twisted in an expression of eternal terror, her glazed eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. "Are you trapped too?" I asked, my voice trembling. She slowly turned toward me, and I felt my blood turn to ice. Half of her face was melted, like wax dripping from a candle. When she spoke, her voice sounded like nails on a chalkboard. "Trapped? We're beyond trapped, Jonas. We are everywhere and nowhere." I recoiled in horror, only to bump into another figure. It was a man, or what was left of him. His body was distorted, limbs bent at impossible angles. He smiled at me, his teeth sharp as needles. "Welcome to eternity, Jonas," he hissed. "You'll love it here. We all do." I ran like I'd never run before, my heart pounding so hard I feared it would burst from my chest. But no matter how fast I ran, the corridor stretched on, and the horrors followed, their laughter echoing off the walls. I don't know how much time passed. Days, weeks, years, time no longer had any meaning in this damned place. I kept entering and exiting elevators, each one taking me to a new, distorted version of reality. At one point, I found myself in a version of the building where everything was upside down. I walked on the ceiling, the inverted gravity making me nauseous. In another, the corridor was flooded with a thick red liquid that I refused to believe was blood. But the worst were the versions of myself that I encountered. Some were older, wrinkled, and worn by time. Others were younger, their eyes shining with an innocence I had long lost. And some were monstrosities that made me question the very sanity of existence. One particularly disturbing version of myself cornered me in one of the corridors. His face was covered in scars, his eyes devoid of any humanity. "There's only one way out of here," he growled, advancing toward me with a rusty knife. "We have to kill all the other versions." I fought him, our forms blending and separating in the chaos of the struggle. When I finally managed to escape, I realized a terrifying truth. I no longer knew which version of myself I was. It was during one of these encounters that the revelation struck me like lightning. I was talking to an older version of myself, his eyes burdened with the weight of countless lives lived. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice tired. "This elevator, this building, it's a bridge between dimensions. We're living all our possible lives at the same time." The understanding hit me with full force. Every choice I had ever made, every path not taken, every possibility, they were all happening simultaneously. And I was stuck in the middle of it all, doomed to experience every single one of them. "But why?" I begged, feeling my sanity crumble. "Why is this happening to us?" My older self smiled sadly. "Who said it's only happening to us? Maybe everyone is trapped in their own dimensional mazes. Maybe this is the true nature of reality." With those words, he vanished, leaving me alone with the weight of this terrible truth. Now, as I write these words, I no longer know who I am. Am I the original Jonas? Am I a copy? Or am I all of them at once? I keep wandering through the corridors, entering and exiting elevators. Sometimes I die, torn apart by monstrous versions of myself or consumed by the horrors lurking in the shadows. But death is not the end. It's just another door, another elevator, leading me to a new version of my fractured existence. I try to hold on to my sanity, but it slips through my fingers like sand. My mind shatters more with each passing moment, each fragment living a different life in a different reality. And the worst part? There is no way out. There is no end. Just the constant hum of the elevator, the flickering lights, and the terror of the unknown waiting for me when the doors open. This is my personal hell, my eternal prison. And as I write these final words, I hear the familiar sound of the elevator arriving. The doors open, inviting me on yet another journey through the nightmare of my own existence. May God have mercy on my fragmented soul. The underground lab was a maze of metal tubes and tangled cables, illuminated by the bluish glow of computer screens. I, Emma, a 19-year-old physics student, was about to witness something extraordinary, or at least that's what I thought. The small university town above us, with its cobblestone streets and old buildings shrouded in perpetual mist, felt like a distant world. Down here, we were on the frontier of science, ready to uncover the secrets of the universe. "Ready, Emma?" asked Dr. Stern, his eyes gleaming behind thick glasses. I nodded, feeling my heart race. Years of studying quantum physics had led me to this moment, the experiment that could prove the existence of alternate realities. The hum of the machines intensified, filling the air with static electricity. I watched in fascination as subatomic particles danced in the accelerator before me. Initiating sequence in 3, 2, 1. A blinding flash flooded the lab. I felt a pull, like being sucked down a cosmic drain. The world around me dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shapes. And then, darkness. When I opened my eyes, the lab was a distorted shadow of what it once was. The walls, once white and sterile, were now covered in a dark, viscous substance. The cutting-edge equipment lay in pieces, scattered across the floor in unrecognizable fragments. The silence was deafening, interrupted only by the steady drip of some unknown liquid. The air smelled acrid, like ozone in decay. "Dr. Stern?" I called, my voice echoing strangely in the empty space. No response. I staggered toward the exit, my steps unsteady on the uneven floor. The lab door, once hermetically sealed, was ajar, creaking softly on rusty hinges. The corridor beyond was a tunnel of dancing shadows. The emergency lights flickered erratically, casting shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. I dragged myself forward, driven by a desperate need to find something familiar. When I finally emerged to the surface, the shock made me stumble. The sky, usually gray and overcast, was now a blood-red dome. The streets of the university town, once filled with students, were deserted. Dead trees twisted against the scarlet horizon, their branches resembling skeletal fingers. "What happened here?" I murmured to myself, the reality of the situation beginning to sink in. This wasn't my world. It couldn't be. A cold wind blew, carrying with it unintelligible whispers. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A hooded figure stood at the end of the street, watching me. My blood ran cold. That wasn't human. I ran. My feet pounded against the cracked pavement, echoing through the empty streets. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling of feet and guttural murmurs. The hooded figures were chasing me, their distorted forms reflected in the broken windows of the abandoned shops. I turned a corner, only to come face to face with more of them. Their faces, hidden beneath their hoods, were blotches of absolute darkness. Skeletal hands reached out toward me, sharp nails cutting through the air. "Leave me alone," I screamed, my voice breaking with terror. Desperate, I dove into a side alley. My heart pounded in my chest, adrenaline coursing through my veins. At the end of the alley, I saw a door slightly ajar. Without a second thought, I hurled myself inside. The house was dark and dusty, furniture draped in sheets forming ghostly silhouettes in the dim light. I rushed up the stairs, 2 steps at a time, searching for a place to hide. Upstairs, I entered a room and closed the door, leaning against it, panting. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of my ragged breathing. Then, I heard it, footsteps coming up the stairs, slow, deliberate. I held my breath, praying to any god that might be listening in this twisted world. The footsteps stopped on the other side of the door, a pause that seemed to stretch into eternity, and then knocks. 3 slow, heavy knocks that reverberated through the wood and straight into my bones. "Emma," a voice whispered, a distorted, hollow version of my own voice. "We found you." I don't know how long I stood frozen in fear, pressed against that door. When I finally gathered the courage to move, the blood-red sun was already setting, plunging the world into an even deeper darkness. I cautiously left the room, expecting at any moment to be attacked by the hooded creatures. But the house was silent, empty. I descended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight, and stepped out into the street. The city had changed again. The streets now formed impossible patterns, dead ends that hadn't existed before, buildings folding over themselves at angles that defied Euclidean geometry. I walked for hours, or maybe days. Time seemed to flow differently here. Sometimes the sky would clear for only a few minutes before plunging back into darkness. Other times, the night seemed to stretch on endlessly. And then I saw something that made my heart stop. It was me, a younger version of myself, maybe 10 years old, sitting on a swing in an abandoned park. "Hello, Emma," the girl said, her voice echoing in an odd way. "You finally made it." "Who? What are you?" I asked, my voice trembling. The girl smiled, a sad smile far too old for her young face. "I am you, a part of you, fragmented by the experiment, trapped in this place between worlds." Before I could process what I was hearing, the scene shifted. Now I was in a graveyard, standing before a headstone with my name on it. An older version of me was beside it, her face marked by time and sorrow. "Every choice, every possibility," the older Emma said, "they all exist simultaneously here. This is the price of our experiment." The realization hit me like a freight train. "I did this," I whispered, horror filling every fiber of my being. "I destroyed the fabric between dimensions." The revelations kept coming, each version of myself revealing a piece of the puzzle. I saw an Emma who never left our hometown, living a simple, happy life. I saw another who became a renowned scientist, making discoveries that changed the world. And I saw distorted versions, corrupted by exposure to interdimensional energies. Each encounter was a blow to my sanity. I began to question who I truly was. Was I the original Emma? Or just another lost fragment in this quantum nightmare? In a particularly grim moment, I encountered a decaying version of myself, her empty eyes fixed on me. "We are the anomaly," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "Our existence is a wound in the fabric of reality. As long as we exist, worlds will continue to collide." The guilt was crushing. I had done this. My ambition, my desire to unlock the secrets of the universe had condemned countless realities. The knowledge weighed on me like a shroud. I wandered the distorted streets of the city, watching as realities overlapped and dissolved around me. One moment I was in a futuristic version of the city, with crystal skyscrapers reaching the clouds. The next, I was in post-apocalyptic ruins, the air thick with ash and distant wails. That's when I understood. There was no going back. There was no way to fix what I had broken. But maybe there was a way to stop more harm from being done. In the center of the city, where the university campus should have been, I found the anomaly. A vortex of pure energy, pulsing with colors beyond the rainbow. It was the epicenter of the dimensional rupture. The versions of myself began to appear, forming a circle around me. Young, old, distorted, they all watched me with a mixture of sadness and expectation. "You know what must be done," they said in unison. I did. To close the breach, to stop more realities from colliding, I had to sacrifice myself. Destroy the source of the anomaly, me, in all my fragmented forms. With trembling steps, I approached the vortex. The energy crackled around me, making the hair on my arms stand on end. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to back away, to run. But I knew there was nowhere to flee. "I'm sorry," I whispered, both to myself and to all the worlds I had inadvertently condemned. I took the final step. The vortex's energy engulfed me, burning and freezing at the same time. I felt every atom of my body being pulled in different directions, my consciousness expanding to encompass every version of myself that existed in this space between worlds. For a moment, I was everything and nothing. I saw the vastness of the multiverse, infinite possibilities unfolding before my eyes. It was both beautiful and terrifying. And then, with a scream that echoed across dimensions, I let go. My existence dissolved, taking with it the anomaly that threatened the fabric of reality. The vortex imploded, a shockwave reverberating through the fabric of space-time. The fragmented realities began to separate, returning to their places of origin. In my last moments of consciousness, I saw the city returning to normal. The sky clearing, the streets filling with life again. I saw Dr. Stern in the lab, looking confused at the equipment that never exploded. I saw versions of myself in other realities, living lives that would now never be interrupted. And then, darkness. Peace. The end of Emma, the scientist who went too far, and the beginning of infinite, untouched possibilities. In the underground lab, an experiment that never happened left only a faint smell of ozone in the air and an inexplicable sense of loss. And somewhere, beyond the veil of reality, the echo of a sacrifice that saved the multiverse slowly faded into the silence of the cosmos. The house was my refuge. Isolated in the middle of a dense forest, I could lose myself in my work, in the intricate projects I loved so much. As an architect, attention to detail was my nature, and solitude allowed me to focus completely on what I did. It was a peculiar structure, my house. I designed it myself. Long hallways, narrow windows that let in little light, creating a comforting dimness. It was a place where everything made sense, every corner, every curve, except for that door. I hadn't noticed it before. It was hidden behind an old bookshelf, a piece I'd never moved in all the years I'd lived there. The discovery was accidental, made during a bored day of rearranging the furniture. A narrow door, made of dark wood, that seemed forgotten by time. It struck me as odd. After all, I knew every inch of that house. How could this have escaped my notice? My first reaction was to ignore it. Maybe it was just a forgotten space, some flaw in the design. But curiosity grew within me. For days, I tried to follow my routine, but I kept catching myself glancing at that hidden spot where the door silently and imposingly called to me. On the third night, after a glass of wine, I couldn't resist any longer. I grabbed an old key, my hand trembling for no apparent reason, and opened the door. Inside, there was only a room. Small. Empty. A cubicle. Yet the air was different there, as if it was saturated with something I couldn't quite define. The atmosphere was heavy, the kind that tightens your chest and makes it hard to breathe freely. I stood there for a few minutes, staring at nothing, until I decided to close the door and return to normal. Or at least, I tried. When I left that room, I felt something strange, something that put me on edge without any clear reason. The house, it was different. The colors, which had always been soft and comforting, now seemed faded. The walls, once imposing, seemed closer, as if the space had shrunk. The silence I used to appreciate was now a burden. It was oppressive, heavy, as though something was waiting, hidden in the shadows, watching me. I ran my hand over the furniture, trying to find some anchor for my sanity. I'm just tired, I thought. I just need to sleep. But as the days passed, I realized it was more than exhaustion. The house, the place I had designed so carefully, seemed to be shifting, adjusting in subtle yet disturbing ways. Time inside it no longer felt the same. Hours dragged on, yet days passed without me noticing. The first shadows appeared in the windows. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. Strange silhouettes, figures moving too quickly for me to be sure of what I saw. But soon, the reflections began moving in the mirrors. In the kitchen window's glass, a figure stood still. It wasn't my shadow. It couldn't be. Something was lurking, waiting. I began to feel fear, but I didn't know of what. When I decided I needed to leave, my mind was already in shambles. I opened the front door and found myself back in the small room I had opened days before. The sensation of being trapped in my own home was immediate. I tried leaving through the front door countless times, and each time I opened it, I ended up back in that cursed, empty, suffocating room. My desperation grew with every failed attempt, and the house around me became more and more unbearable. My already fragile perception of time began to disintegrate. Days and nights blurred into a shapeless haze, with no beginning or end. The shadows in the windows started to take more defined forms. There were faces now, pale and expressionless, staring at me from outside, as if they knew something I didn't. The bathroom mirror, once a simple reflection of my exhaustion, now showed more than just my worn figure. It showed versions of me, older, more tired. Sunken eyes, graying hair that wasn't mine, yet somehow seemed to belong to me. When I looked into my own eyes, I saw an absence, a void that grew larger with each passing day. I'm losing my mind, I thought. But even that thought felt trivial in the face of what was happening around me. The house, my most perfect creation, had become my jailer. I began to understand that the door wasn't just an entrance to another room. It was a rift, a passage between my reality and something I couldn't comprehend. Each time I tried to escape, the house pulled me deeper, leading me into distorted versions of itself, each more grotesque and twisted than the last. The figures in the mirrors and windows were alternate versions of me. Broken men, disfigured by time and madness. They were trapped there, just like I was. They watched me, waiting for me to become part of this cycle of destruction too. I realized the house was alive. It fed on me, on my fear, on my hopelessness. And now, it was pushing me to the edge of my sanity, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist. Everything I saw around me was an illusion created by the house. I was no longer in control of my mind. It was. In the end, I understood I had never left myself. The door I opened that day behind the bookshelf was an opening into me. Everything I saw, the distorted versions, the shadows, were reflections of what I had become. Each attempt to escape only took me deeper into my own mind. I was trapped in an endless cycle, repeating the same nightmare. The house was merely a manifestation of my fear, of the guilt I carried but could never face. The room, the door, the reflections, they were all pieces of a puzzle I would never be able to solve. Now all that remains is the silence. The house and I, trapped together forever. When I decided I needed to leave, my mind was already in shambles. I opened the front door and found myself back in the small room I had opened days before. The sensation of being trapped in my own home was immediate. I tried leaving through the front door countless times, and each time I opened it, I ended up back in that cursed, empty, suffocating room. My desperation grew with every failed attempt, and the house around me became more and more unbearable. My already fragile perception of time began to disintegrate. Days and nights blurred into a shapeless haze, with no beginning or end. The shadows in the windows started to take more defined forms. There were faces now, pale and expressionless, staring at me from outside, as if they knew something I didn't. The bathroom mirror, once a simple reflection of my exhaustion, now showed more than just my worn figure. It showed versions of me, older, more tired. Sunken eyes, graying hair that wasn't mine, yet somehow seemed to belong to me. When I looked into my own eyes, I saw an absence, a void that grew larger with each passing day. I'm losing my mind, I thought. But even that thought felt trivial in the face of what was happening around me. The house, my most perfect creation, had become my jailer. I began to understand that the door wasn't just an entrance to another room. It was a rift, a passage between my reality and something I couldn't comprehend. Each time I tried to escape, the house pulled me deeper, leading me into distorted versions of itself, each more grotesque and twisted than the last. The figures in the mirrors and windows were alternate versions of me. Broken men, disfigured by time and madness. They were trapped there, just like I was. They watched me, waiting for me to become part of this cycle of destruction too. I realized the house was alive. It fed on me, on my fear, on my hopelessness. And now, it was pushing me to the edge of my sanity, and I didn't know how much longer I could resist. Everything I saw around me was an illusion created by the house. I was no longer in control of my mind. It was. In the end, I understood I had never left myself. The door I opened that day behind the bookshelf was an opening into me. Everything I saw, the distorted versions, the shadows, were reflections of what I had become. Each attempt to escape only took me deeper into my own mind. I was trapped in an endless cycle, repeating the same nightmare. The house was merely a manifestation of my fear, of the guilt I carried but could never face. The room, the door, the reflections, they were all pieces of a puzzle I would never be able to solve. Now all that remains is the silence. The house and I, trapped together forever. The shrill sound of the alarm clock sliced through the silence of my apartment, yanking me out of a restless sleep. I, Harper Sullivan, 31 years old, corporate lawyer, opened my eyes to face another day in the city that never sleeps. My apartment on the 40th floor offered a panoramic view of glass and steel skyscrapers, a sea of lights flickering against the gray dawn sky. It was breathtaking, but somehow, it always made me feel small, insignificant. As I got ready for work, I glanced at my reflection in the bathroom mirror. Perfectly styled brown hair, an impeccable suit, flawless makeup, the image of the successful woman I had become. But the eyes staring back at me seemed empty. disconnected. The elevator descended silently through the building's floors. The sterile white walls reflected my distorted image. For a moment, I had the unsettling feeling that the woman in the reflection wasn't me, but a stranger wearing my skin. I shook my head, dismissing the thought. It was just work stress, I told myself. Nothing that a good night's sleep couldn't fix. Yet as I walked through the bustling city streets, surrounded by a crowd of unfamiliar faces, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A sense of displacement, as if I didn't truly belong in this world. Little did I know, that feeling was just the beginning. It was on a Friday night that everything changed. I had just returned from another long day at the office, my high heels echoing down the empty halls of my floor. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of the air conditioning. When I opened the door to my apartment, I noticed something out of place. A cream-colored envelope, elegant, lay on the cold marble floor. I frowned. I hadn't received physical mail in years, much less something so old-fashioned. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. The paper was thick, textured, with a faint scent of lavender. The words were written in elegant, almost hypnotic handwriting. Dear Miss Sullivan, you are cordially invited to a night of mystery and revelation. Shadow Street, 1313. Tonight, at midnight. Come discover the truth about who you really are. There was no sender, no other information, just those cryptic words and an address I had never heard of. My rational mind screamed that this was madness. Going to an unknown place in the middle of the night, based on a mysterious invitation? It was the start of every horror movie I'd ever watched. But there was something about that invitation. Something that spoke directly to the part of me that had always felt out of place, as if I had been living the wrong life. The promise of discovering who I really was irresistible. I looked at the clock. 11:30 p.m. If I was going to go, I'd have to leave now. With my heart racing and the sensation that I was about to make the biggest mistake of my life, I grabbed my bag and walked out the door. The taxi dropped me off in front of a rusted iron gate. Beyond it, a Victorian mansion loomed against the night sky, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching me. The street was deserted, shrouded in a dense fog that seemed to swallow sound. The air was heavy, filled with an acrid smell that made me wrinkle my nose. It was almost like the smell of ozone after a storm, but there was something else, something rotten. I pushed the gate, which creaked open with an agonizing groan. The path to the front door was paved with uneven stones, and every step I took seemed to echo throughout the property. When I reached the door, it opened before I could knock. A tall, pale man with sunken eyes greeted me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Welcome, Miss Sullivan," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "We've been expecting you." I stepped into a grand entrance hall lit by chandeliers casting flickering shadows on the faded wallpapered walls. The air inside the house was even heavier, laden with the sickly sweet scent of decaying flowers. People in formal attire wandered through the hall, their laughter and conversations sounding distorted, as if they were underwater. As I approached, I noticed their eyes were glazed, their expressions frozen in vacant smiles. A woman in a blood-red dress approached, her face a mask of perfect, artificial beauty. "Harper, darling," she said, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. "I'm so glad you've joined us. Now the party can truly begin." Before I could respond, the room began to spin. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting like a living organism. The people around me started to contort, their features melting like hot wax. I wanted to scream, wanted to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was trapped, helpless, watching as the world around me dissolved into chaos. I don't know how long I remained in that state of paralyzing horror. When I finally managed to move, the hall was empty. The candles had burned out, leaving only the faint light of the moon filtering through the dusty windows. I ran to the door, but it had vanished, replaced by a solid wall. Desperate, I tried every door I could find, only to find myself in new rooms, each more disturbing than the last. In one room, I saw myself lying in a hospital bed, tubes and machines connected to my lifeless body. In another, I stood before a mirror, but my reflection was that of a decrepit old woman, her eyes filled with infinite sorrow. Every door I opened led to a new version of my life, each one more terrifying than the last. In one reality, I was a serial killer, my hands covered in blood. In another, I was the one being hunted, running through dark alleys, the sound of footsteps always just behind me. The mansion had become a labyrinth of nightmares, each room a window into a life that could have been mine. And in every one of those lives, I saw the same despair, the same feeling of being lost and out of place that I had always felt. It was then that I understood. These weren't just possibilities, they were realities. Versions of myself trapped in different dimensions, all converging at this cosmic intersection. And at the center of it all, one burning question: who had sent the invitation, and why? Exhausted and on the brink of madness, I opened yet another door. This time, I found myself in an office that seemed like a distorted version of my own. Sitting behind the desk was myself, but it wasn't exactly me. This version of Harper Sullivan had gray hair, eyes marked by deep wrinkles, and a scar that sliced across her face from forehead to chin. "Finally," she said, her voice tired yet tinged with relief, "you've arrived." "But what are you?" I stammered, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. She smiled sadly. "I am you, Harper, or rather, a version of you. The version that uncovered the truth about our situation." She told me a story that defied everything I believed to be real. About how our consciousness was fragmented across multiple dimensions. About how the mansion was a nexus, a point of convergence where all these realities met. "I escaped," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I managed to leave this cursed place, but I couldn't leave the others behind. So I sent the invitations, hoping that at least one of us could be saved." "But why?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Why do this to us?" Her expression darkened. "Because, Harper, we don't belong anywhere. We are anomalies, fragments of a consciousness that shouldn't exist. And as long as we exist, the dimensions will continue to collide, threatening the very fabric of reality." The words of the other Harper echoed in my mind, each syllable a hammer striking my already fragile sanity. I wanted to deny it, to scream that it was impossible. But deep down, I knew it was true. It explained the feeling of dislocation I had always felt, the emptiness that no professional success or personal relationship had ever filled. "What can we do?" I asked, my voice little more than a whisper. The other Harper stood up, walking to a window that looked out into a black, infinite void. "There's only one way to fix this," she said, her voice laden with infinite sadness. "We need to erase our existence, all of our versions, in all dimensions." The horror of the situation hit me with full force. "You mean, kill ourselves?" She turned to me, her eyes shining with iron determination. "It's not death, Harper. It's correction. Restoring the balance that our existence has disturbed." As she spoke, I heard distant screams, echoing through the hallways of the mansion. The other versions of ourselves, trapped in their own dimensional nightmares. "And if we refuse?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Then we'll remain trapped here forever," she replied. Reliving our worst fears and regrets for all eternity, while the dimensions around us collapse. The choice before me was impossible. Accept the end of my existence or condemn countless versions of myself to eternal torment. With trembling hands, I took the invitation that was still in my pocket. The paper seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if it were the key to all this madness. "What should I do?" I asked, tears streaming down my face. The other Harper extended her hand. "Give me the invitation. Together, we can end this." With a heavy heart and a mind in turmoil, I handed the invitation to my older counterpart. The moment our fingers touched, a surge of energy coursed through my body, and the world around us began to disintegrate. The walls of the office dissolved into a haze of impossible colors and shapes. I heard screams, my own screams, echoing through 1,000 different throats, from 1,000 different versions of Harper Sullivan. I saw flashes of lives that could have been mine. A happy Harper in a loving marriage, another lost on the streets as a homeless person, one at the top of the corporate world, and another languishing in a prison cell. All of them, aspects of a single fragmented consciousness, now converging at one point. The invitation in our hands glowed with an intense light, consuming everything around us. I felt my own being dissolving, my consciousness expanding to encompass all the Harpers that had ever existed or could exist. For a brief moment, I understood everything. I saw the fabric of the multiverse, the delicate threads connecting all realities. And I saw the damage that our anomalous existence had caused, the fissures threatening to tear apart the entire cosmos. "It is done," I heard the voice of the other Harper, now indistinguishable from my own. "Finally, we can rest." As my consciousness dissolved, I felt a peace I had never known in life. The weight of an existence that was never meant to be was finally lifted. In my last moments of self-awareness, I saw the multiverse healing. The fissures caused by our existence closed, realities realigned, and balance was restored. And then, darkness, silence, peace. Somewhere in some reality, an apartment on the 40th floor remained empty. A promising legal career never began. A life that could have been simply was not. But the multiverse continued, healed and whole. And somewhere beyond time and space, the consciousness that once was Harper Sullivan finally found its place.